We ended our last video by importing data that we were going to use to make a bar chart. In this video, we will use that data to make a basic bar chart so that you can see how that is done. We begin again by reminding us that we have imported data and it appears in the data view panel on the right. We are going to be taking this data and building a bar chart inside our page that is shown in the middle using the panel called Editing that is on the left. What I'm going to do is come over and Views defaults by having a page open with a graph ready to go. What I'm going to do is delete this so I can show you how to build this up from scratch in case you need to. In order to delete things, you can select Page and then use the Delete button on the right side of the button bar. When I click this button, you'll see that page 1 will disappear. What we're left with is now a blank template for setting things up. In order to create a new page, we use the New Page button that is all the way on the left side of the button bar. Clicking a new page will have page 1 reappear. This page is now blank. What we need in order to support a graphic is to create a set of axes that we can use the button 2 over to create a set of axes. That now appears. When I click that button, what appeared was just something that simply said Graph 1 within page 1. If I click the chevron to the left, that expands it, and I see that it is also giving me an X axis and a Y axis within the graph that is Graph 1. By selecting Graph 1 instead of page 1, I need to be selecting Graph 1. I can specify the type of graph that I want to use. We're interested in bar charts, and so I will click the bar chart button in the button menu. Clicking the bar chart adds a new element, bar 1. Bar 1 starts highlighted, and because it's highlighted, we can control its behavior inside of the Properties menu. The properties that were of interest are the lengths of the bars that we want to make, where they sit, whether they're going to run vertical or horizontal, whether they're grouped, if we have a key text associated with each one of these, whether we have axis X or axis Y associated with it, and what sort of labels it's going to have. We'll use all of these. What I want to point out is if we want to control the properties of bar, we have to have it selected. If I click instead on graph, I will get the properties of the graph. If I click on the x-axis, I'll get the properties of the x-axis. Because we want to control the properties of the bar, we'll highlight bar. The first property that we're going to be concerned with is the lengths. We would like to have the lengths of these bars be equal to the property of Facebook visitors. That's our 1D data. In order to do that, I'll just use this drop-down menu to select from the available data. Even though we have data that says age groups, Views is smart enough to know that the bar lengths will only be numeric, and so it's only letting us choose for numeric data that exists. By selecting Facebook visitors, I will automatically get bars that appear. You'll also notice Views has automatically scaled the y-axis so that it runs to just slightly below the smallest value, just slightly above the largest value. That's something that we'll adjust in just a moment. But at this point, we do have a bar chart. It is not yet labeled, and maybe the orientation is not the greatest, but we have a bar chart. So I say let's first work on getting labels in. If we want to use the labels that we already have set up under the data set in age group, then we need to do 2 steps. The first is to specify that the age group should be our labels. For this, we go back to the Properties menu, we scroll down till the bottom thing that says Labels, and then from here, under Labels, we select Age Group. At this point, we have told the program that we are going to use labels age group to label our bars. You'll notice, however, that on the plot, the x-axis has labels of 1, 2, 3, 4. And so we are not using these labels yet. That's because the axis thinks that it should be using numbers instead of labels to label the data. In order to change this, we'll use the property of the x-axis. So we first select x-axis, then we go down to the properties view, and inside the properties view we tell it the mode for this axis is not numeric, but instead are labels. Now we have the words appear that came from our age group data. The bars are labeled. Of course, when we look at these labels, it's fairly hard to read. That's because the labels are pretty long and they run together. We have several options to fix this. One would be to make the labels smaller, where the bars fall farther apart. I think perhaps the simplest thing to do is to change the orientation of the bars, which we'll do next. In order to do that, we select bar again, and then look to the properties window. Bar. In the properties window, what we want to do is we want to look for the section that says direction, and then we select horizontal instead of vertical. What you can see is that we have changed the direction of the bars, but that changed the labels. So in order to fix this, we'll go through the same steps we've seen before, except for the y-axis. Let's do that very quick. We've seen it before, so I'm not going to highlight anything. Instead, I'm going to go in the editing pane, select the y-axis. I am going to then look for the section under properties that says mode and change that to labels. What we can see is that now we have text next to these bars, except we can't quite see it all because there's not enough space between this bar and the side. Let's fix that next. What we want to do is create more space here. This is what's called the margin, and it's contained within the graph. Or another way of saying it is the property of the graph. So we click on graph. You'll see it's not part of the properties. In fact, what we want to do is instead control the formatting, which is in the top right. Under formatting, we can see that there's an option for left margin. And so inside this left margin, we are simply going to put in a larger space than 1.7 centimeters. Let's try 2 centimeters to see what happens. We can see that the margin just increased a little bit, but not nearly enough. So how about 5 centimeters? Too large now. What about 4? Maybe even 3.5. Now we're getting to a point where the margin on the left is large enough that we can read all the labels that we're interested in. That's great. We have one last step, which is that the x-axis no longer has numbers. The reason is that we had changed it to labels, but assigned no labels into the x-axis. And so what we're going to do now, the x-axis should be the numerical range associated with this. So let's go back and select the x-axis, and then under x-axis we go to its properties, and we change the mode again to numeric. Now we have the numbers back. One thing I don't like about this plot is that it does not start at 0. This is something we haven't talked about yet, but in general I would advocate that bar charts should start at 0. And so the last thing we need to do is make sure that the x-axis starts at 0. In order to do this, we're again going to look under the x-axis properties, and what you can see is that max and min data associated with the range. This is set to auto, and what Views always does is try to maximize the spread of data that we see inside the plot. That means it's going to start roughly near the minimum value we have and go to roughly just above the maximum value we have. But we want it to start at 0, so we're going to change the value of min to 0 and hit enter. And the bars have now rescaled so that the x-axis runs from 0 to 35, and we have the full range of data. At this point, we have a finished plot. It does not look beautiful yet, but that's not the point. The point is to familiarize ourselves with how we can use data to make a plot in views, and then to export this in a way that is useful. For this homework assignment, you're just to take a screenshot of this entire views window and upload it to me so that I can see what you have. The last thing I'll mention is that if you don't like the blue dotted line on the x-axis, you can get rid of this by clicking off the x-axis in the editing window. If I go up here and click on graph, you'll see the blue line now goes around the whole graph. If I click on page, it goes around the whole page. If I go up here, click it one higher, it doesn't change that. So about the best you're going to get is, at this point, probably, is to highlight the whole page. And now you have something you can take a screenshot of and export, and I can see that you know how to use views so that when we start doing more detailed things, you have the skill set required.